This is the prison that invented silence. Built in 1829, Eastern State Penitentiary was the first prison to enforce complete isolation and silence from its inmates. Complete silence. So, if you've ever been to a library before, you know how difficult it can be. But imagine trying to live in a place where not only are you surrounded by people who are also trying to be silent, but you are forbidden from speaking even when you're alone. Sounds impossible, right? Well, this prison made it a reality for hundreds of men over the course of a century. It led to the creation of the world's first system of solitary confinement. And the effects it had were so disturbing that it changed the way we punish criminals to this day. When you picture a prison, what kind of environment do you see in your mind? Bars, maybe some bunk beds, some inmates flexing their muscles while everyone else does squats. Maybe you picture an outdoor yard where inmates play sports or just walk around chatting with each other. In fact, that's what prisons used to be like. Places where criminals could still interact with each other, with the guards, with visitors. But all of that would change at Eastern State Penitentiary. From the moment they entered through the large iron gates, prisoners would enter a world of silence. The cell blocks were designed in a way that prevented any sound from passing through. They were made up of many small cells, each one containing a bed, a desk, and a toilet, but no windows. This wasn't a problem, though, because every cell had skylights directly above the inmates' beds. And those skylights were there for more than just letting light into the cells. They were designed so that the guards could watch the inmates without them knowing. No bars. The prison walls were so thick that even if the inmates screamed at the top of their lungs, nobody outside would be able to hear them. But the silence didn't just apply to the inmates. The guards were also forbidden from speaking, which created an eerie and unsettling atmosphere throughout the prison. Prisoners arrived at Eastern State already having committed crimes that put them in the worst of America's criminal classes. Things like theft, murder, and rape. But after spending just a few hours in the prison, many of them began to show signs of mental breakdown. Some started screaming and thrashing about in their cells, while others sat quietly staring at the walls. Many began to rock back and forth or make strange repetitive motions. Others grew beards and let their hair and nails grow long, refusing to cut them despite having the tools provided to them. One inmate would spend 34 years rocking back and forth in his cell without stopping. It was clear to the staff that something about the prison was causing these breakdowns. But rather than adjusting anything, they decided to double down. In 1840, the warden implemented what became known as the Pennsylvania system, a new set of rules that enforced absolute silence and isolation. Prisoners were no longer allowed to communicate with anyone, including the guards, other inmates, or even themselves. They weren't even allowed to talk to their own lawyers. At first, they tried to keep the inmates busy with work, giving them things like tailoring, shoemaking, and bookbinding. But it wasn't enough. It soon became obvious that even if inmates had jobs, they were still deteriorating mentally. So then they added religious services to the daily schedule, hoping that God would bring some peace to the troubled souls inside. But that didn't help either. It quickly became apparent that the inmates needed more stimulation. So the administration introduced books and newspapers, believing that reading would occupy their minds and prevent them from going crazy. This, however, proved to be a mistake, because the next step was to start allowing some inmates to have radios. And now, rather than preventing madness, the prison staff had actually succeeded in driving their inmates insane. The silence was broken once again, but this time it was filled with angry, shouting matches between inmates over whose radio was whose. Fights broke out over music, arguments erupted over politics, and before long, the whole prison was in chaos again. It was such a mess that administrators had to revert back to the original plan of total silence and isolation. At this point, it should be pretty obvious that something wasn't working here. For years, the prison staff had been making adjustments to try to improve conditions, but nothing seemed to help. What had started out as a well-intentioned experiment to reform criminals had turned into a nightmare of madness and despair. Despite all the attempts to fix it, Eastern State had become a place where criminals went to lose their minds. And yet, in spite of all the evidence showing that this wasn't working, This became the model for prisons around the world. So why did they go back to it? Well, you've got to remember that when Eastern State was built, there were very few options for dealing with criminals. Most prisons simply housed them until their sentence was over, at which point they were released back into society with little to no rehabilitation. But this new prison was different. It was supposed to be a place where criminals could be fixed, where they could be punished and reformed so that they could return home as productive members of society. And although it drove them insane, the prison staff believed that it was worth it. The warden saw the inmates' descent into madness not as a failure, but as proof that their methods were working. He argued that insanity was a necessary part of the process, claiming that if you really wanted to reform a criminal, you had to break them completely in order to rebuild them in your own image. Insane or not, he said, it was better for them to be locked up and safe inside Eastern State than out committing more crimes. Of course, that's a pretty dark way of looking at it. But keep in mind, this is the same guy who thought that the best way to deal with unruly prisoners was to lock them in cells with padded walls and no windows. But there was another reason why Eastern State was such a success. It was because of the sheer terror that the prison inspired in the hearts of criminals everywhere. Before Eastern State, most prisons were notoriously overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and unsanitary. They were places where criminals went to do their time and come back out worse than when they went in. But Eastern State was different. It was seen as a place where bad guys went to die, a place where sane men went and lost their minds. It had earned the reputation of being the most terrifying prison in the world. Inmates were so desperate to avoid this place that they would turn themselves in for minor crimes just to get out of Eastern State. Once one of the inmates got into a fight with a guard and was sentenced to 5 years at Eastern State. But instead of waiting for the police to come take him away, he picked up a chair and smashed it over the guard's head, knocking him unconscious. When the police arrived and saw what he'd done, they asked him why he'd gone to such extreme measures. To which he replied, "I never wanted to go to Eastern State. It had become so infamous that criminals preferred death to life inside." And that's exactly what the administration wanted. As the years passed, Eastern State continued to operate as normal, slowly losing popularity as the century wore on and finally closing its doors in 1913. Today, it stands abandoned, a haunting reminder of the dark days when insanity was considered a legitimate form of punishment. And although it may be empty now, the legacy of Eastern State lives on in prisons around the world, serving as inspiration for the most brutal punishments imaginable. Many people believe that modern prisons are too lenient, that criminals don't receive the punishment they deserve, and that we've strayed too far away from the tougher methods of the past. But after learning about Eastern State, do you agree or not? Is it cruel and unusual punishment to keep a man in a tiny cell with no one to speak to for years on end? Or do you think it's a necessary evil in the pursuit of justice? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're there, make sure you subscribe for more videos like these. I've been your host. See you next time.